Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very, very special gathering. My name's Claire Konkes, and I'm a senior lecturer in the media program at the University of Tasmania. And tonight we are all here to celebrate the power of storytelling and the importance of stories we tell about ourselves and our history. And for this reason, I would particularly like to recognise and celebrate the deep history and culture of this island and acknowledge the traditional owners, the Palawa people, custodians of the land upon which we meet. And I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and particularly and warmly welcome members of that community who have joined us tonight. Each year the university puts on hundreds of lectures, forums, screenings, workshops to connect our students and our alumni and the broader community to share stories and knowledge for everyone's benefit. So tonight brings the efforts of many people, and on behalf of the university, the Judith Neilson Foundation of Journalism and Ideas, the Australian Cinema Society and the Australian Institute of International Affairs, a few people put their heads together for this one, it is my pleasure to welcome you. It is a jam-packed evening, so we're going to stay on our toes. So before we settle in to watch David's very fine film, David would like to say a few words, followed by his friend and our special guest, the award-winning author and journalist Tim Bowden. And after the screening, David will be joined by ABZ presenter Sabra Lane for a quick chat and Q&A and conversation. And then we'll go on upstairs where there'll be refreshments for the conversation to continue. But for now, I'd love to introduce you to David Brill.
First of all, thank you very much for coming. It's a great honour to have everybody here, particularly being a Tasmanian and starting off here back in 1966 with the ABC and 67 with the bushfires, and that made me realise what I wanted to do in my life. And now that I'm 78 and have so much material that's with the ABC and with me, before I got too old, I wanted to do something with it, because I think history is so important. And I ran into my old friend Bob Kersley, who produced the film, at a Melbourne Press Club function, and Bob thought it was worth doing for no money, just because we believed in it. And we got a small grant from the Judith Neilson Institute for Journalism and Ideas to make the first one of it. We hope to do a couple more. And I'd like to thank a few people, if I can, then I'll get off, who made this all possible. Well, first of all, of course, Bob Kersley. Without Bob, and Bob used to be the Director of News and Current Affairs for the ABC and held very distinguished senior management positions with the BBC. And I first met Bob in Southeast Asia when he was the bureau chief for the BBC, and I met him in Vietnam back in the 70s. So to you, Bob, especially, thank you very much for making it all happen. Bob, thanks, Bob. Rob Hazelwood, who was the executive producer, can't be with us tonight. He's got to go into hospital. He'll be all right. So to him, and to Jimmy Hamilton, the editor, who's a terrific editor. On this type of film, we needed an editor who understood a bit about history, because there's so much material, and picked the best pieces out of it. And so Jimmy came down from Sydney, and we set an editing room up in my basement, and he sort of put it together under Bob's direction, which was really terrific. Gavin Morris, the ABC, who's just retired as the National News Director, he gave us a lot of encouragement in the ABC so we could get it on their news channel, which is very important. Mark Ryan from the Institute, of course. Michael Reid at the ABC News channel, who made it possible to run it. And to the university, to Claire, to Carly, who was on the front desk there with that beautiful smile, who pulled it all together, to Jeff Harriott, who came on board as a former ABC correspondent in Delhi and a senior executive with the ABC. And to you, Sabra Lane, thank you very much for making the time to do this when you've got to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I really do appreciate it very much. And of course, to Adam Rybel, who's a young friend of mine. He's a cinematographer and an editor who contribute a lot of the technical skills to get it together. And so here we are, and I really hope you enjoy it, because it really is looking back at history, looking back. And I was a young man when I went and covered the Vietnam War, and I realised when I first got there, this war's going to go nowhere. We're eventually going to all pull out of here. And we did. But 50,000 Americans died, over 2 million Vietnamese, 500 Australians, let alone all the psychological problems that a lot of returning soldiers had. What did we achieve? Nothing. And when I left Vietnam on one of the last flights out, I thought this could never happen again. I really believe surely as people we've learnt that there's no time for war, or it's just waste of time. And I've covered everything since then, not in news so much, but in thoughtful long pieces about what war's about, the suffering of people, refugees and so forth. And here we are now back in Ukraine, which is absolutely horrible. But I think if we don't learn from history, we won't learn anything. And I'll leave it at that, and thank you very much all for coming.
There really are so many people here. That's such a wonderful audience, and people have come together to celebrate David. And someone did whisper in my ear earlier, this is a very esteemed crowd. I quite liked that. So perhaps we can just have a moment to say, to introduce Tim Bowden. Hardly needs an introduction, Tim, but I will do it. Another Tasmanian, an award-winning broadcaster, radio and television documentary maker, oral historian and author, and celebrated war cameraman and journalist as well. Many would know his 1987 biography of cameraman Neil Davis, One Crowded Hour. I felt like I grew up with it on my bookshelf. I still see it in many bookshelves. So it remains in print and is a familiar addition to people's bookshelves. Stumbled there. So Tim, come on up.
I'm sure I don't have to tell anyone in this auditorium that David Brill is a passionate Tasmanian. In fact, he even appointed himself as a roving ambassador when he was overseas, and I'm sure did lots of excellent work. Now, in my memoir, spooling through an irreverent memoir, I wrote of my extreme displeasure at the brutal disfigurement of my island home at the very heart of international diplomacy, the United Nations headquarters in New York. This goes back to 1967, when I was posted to New York from Singapore to the plush members bar, lounge and dining room in the United Nations, where journalists are allowed to go. Behind the bar was a map of the world with all the countries cleverly shaped from pieces of wood and attached to the wall by wooden ferrules. Under Australia, Tasmania was upside down. For nearly 2 years, I eyed it off mournfully, planning to absorb enough Dutch courage to vault over the bar and twist it round the right way. But I never did. It's probably still reversed to this day. At least it was there. Now, both Neil Davis and David Brill are on the record as being proud Tasmanians. David has even gone so far as I said, to take on his role as the ambassador. It's difficult to comprehend, but if he were here with us today, Neil Davis would be 88 years old. But he would certainly have looked younger than that and would probably claim to be only 70. Much has been said about Neil's remarkable qualities, his professional bravery, and generally, as the 37th anniversary of his improbable death in that attempted Thai coup in Bangkok has now passed. I thought that I would speak about how I came to write Neil's biography, One Crowded Hour, with Neil's cooperation, of course. The idea came to me in 1976, a year after the Indochina War ended. I realised that Neil was a terrific story, but like most cameramen, he was unlikely to write it himself. His own prose was in fact rather sparse and factual, honed by scripts pared down to cover 30 seconds or maybe 2 or 3 minutes at the most to go with his footage from Vietnam and elsewhere with Visnews. But he told wonderfully evocative stories, had an almost photographic memory, and was an ideal subject for oral history and an as-told-to autobiography. That was my stock in trade up to that time, and I had used similar techniques in recording conversations with George Aspinall, the so-called Changi photographer, who took clandestine photographs not only in and around Changi, but more remarkably up on the Thai-Burma Railway. The ABC published Changi Photographer in 1984, and I was looking for a new project. Next time Neil came back to Australia on holiday, he was then working for NBC, I hit him with a suggestion, and he was quite attracted to the idea, but said that all his life's collection of still photographs had to be abandoned in Phnom Penh when he left his apartment. He had, however, quite a number of photographs that friends had sent him, and we thought that we could make do with those. But how to get him on tape? By 1976, he was working as a one-man band for NBC in any country where a story broke. He would go in solo, jump in front of his own camera to set the scene, film the action, whatever it was, and file audio for radio and telex news copy. Given a short-handled broom, he could have swept the floor at the same time. If the story got too big for him to handle after 4 or 5 days of this frenzied activity, he would tell NBC and they would send another crew in. But he saved them many dollars by breaking stories in areas as diverse as Africa, the Middle East, and of course his beloved Southeast Asia by himself. After the first tranche of tapes I recorded with him face-to-face in the 1970s, I prepared 4 half-hour documentaries for ABC Radio and called them the Neil Davis Tapes, dealing mainly with his 11 years of combat coverage in Indochina and the dramatic events in Cambodia and Vietnam at the end of the war. Those aroused a lot of interest, and it was about this time that David Bradbury dropped a project he was working on, which entailed interviewing any Australian war correspondent he could get his hands on, and concentrate on Neil Davis. The result was, of course, the excellent Frontline. Happily for the forthcoming Neil Davis Exhibition Centre, Carmel Terranius is making progress, what I heard tonight, about the Sorel area. His family, their convict ancestry, not a fashionable thing to have in the early 20th century, and his eclectic collection of uncles, aunts, cousins and siblings whose eccentricities and doings were covered very thoroughly indeed, including local characters like the forbidding Adam Featherston, who exited by having a premonition of his own death and starting to dig his own grave until he carked beside it. One extremely lucky break was to get Neil on my own for several days and take him up to a bush hut owned by a friend in the Yarramalong Valley north of Sydney when he came to Australia in July 1985 to cover the visit to Australia and the region of the American Secretary of State George Shultz. In the days before mobile phones, I was able to spirit him away and record him pretty solidly for about 48 hours about other aspects of his life other than Sorel. NBC executives were meanwhile going apeshit trying to contact him to get him on a plane out of Australia to his next assignment. Of course, neither of us knew that that would be our last meeting and the final recording session for the book. When he flew out, I realised that there has to be a time in writing a book when you stop collecting and actually start to write something. And so it was, and this is detailed in One Crowded Hour. I sat down at my Commodore 64 computer, remember those, anybody? And 4-inch discs, and started to draft a first chapter. I typed "Attitudes to Fate and Death" as the heading and started isolating the quotes about Neil's attitude to risk and combat and the instinctive reaction to danger that kicked in when his adrenaline started pumping, to the point where he actually dropped to the ground just before a shot was fired. I took a break mid-morning and walked up to the local Northbridge shops to get something, I forget what. When I got back, the answer phone light was blinking, and it was Peter Hollinshead, my former boss in Singapore, and Neil's too, in a way, because the Viz News operation in Singapore had been run out of the ABC's office in Peck Hay Road. Stuttering as Peter did in the grip of emotion, he managed to get out the terrible news that Neil had been killed while covering a Thai coup in Bangkok. Attempting to cope with this appalling revelation, I glanced at the computer where, under the heading "Attitudes to Fate and Death," my next words, taken from Neil's transcript, mocked me from the screen. Of course, a sense of instinct doesn't stop a well-aimed bullet. You can always be killed, unluckily killed. Clearly the book would have to be rethought. At that point I wasn't even sure I could continue. When I was able to face up to it, I realised that it could not now be an as-told-to autobiography, and I would need the reminiscences of Neil's colleagues and friends who'd known him. The publishers, William Collins, now HarperCollins, asked me how long it would take me to finish the book. I said I didn't know, but I did want Neil's voice to tell most of the story. Now, that was achieved in due course by additional third-person comment, including my own, being differentiated by bringing the text back to the left margin and qualifying the type on the right, where Neil's direct quotes were used. There was an extra space between the previous paragraph and the words not justified to the right to make it more conversational. I'm happy to say that in about 75% of the book, Neil's voice speaks directly to the reader. In some ways, I think I unconsciously used the technique of a radio documentary with Neil's voice broken by narration either by me or other sources. Anyway, One Crowded Hour was first published in 1987 and became a bestseller. I was more concerned with having chronicled the life of my friend Neil Davis in a way he would have wished. That I cannot know, but at least his story was told at that time, and I hope has done justice to the life of this superb professional. Now, talking of superb professionals brings me to David Brill, whom I knew in Hobart when he was cutting his photographic teeth apprenticed to that rather temperamental photographer and cameraman Brian Curtis in his underground studio next to the Hobart Post Office. Later, David would join Neil Davis in covering the Vietnam War and other overseas conflicts, and they got to know each other very well. Recently, I had the good fortune to be told of his latest documentary we are about to see tonight, and it was curiously only broadcast on the ABC's news channel and could be viewed through their streaming platform iView. David suggested I write to David Anderson, the ABC's managing director, to see if the ABC would consider producing further documentaries showcasing David Brill's astonishing career and his archival film, much of which is held by the ABC. This is what I wrote. Dear David Anderson, I'm writing to you after having seen the excellent documentary David Brill's Story on the Front Line, broadcast on the ABC News Channel and now available on iView. I remain bemused why this compelling and insightful program wasn't first broadcast on the mainstream ABC channels. My friendship with David began in Hobart when we both made way into the ABC by different pathways. David suffered from dyslexia, and still does, which blighted his school days and was instrumental in choosing the cinematographic pathway, following in the footsteps of our mutual friend Neil Davis. And then covering the Vietnam War and other international disasters in Asia, Africa, North and South America, working for Four Corners and Dateline for SBS, spanning nearly half a century. He still looks about 20 years younger than he should. Now in his late 70s, I was amazed to see his polished and engaging role in On the Front Line as a presenter of what turned out to be a fascinating journey through the Vietnam War, through his Vietnam War experiences, with moving sequences of his trademark depiction of children caught up in the horrors of war. In 2017, after only one of 3 cinematographers ever inducted into the Australian Media Hall of Fame, he said, "My main focus has always been the suffering of people. It's easy to film guns going off. It's in the suffering, the battles, the refugees, what happens to all those people who can't leave. That's what I was always tried to care about and film." Mike Willesee later said he was the best cameraman of his era. He has the great ability to capture what has happened in one take, a take that held longer and told you more. He is a strange combination of artist and action man. Now, David Brill teamed up with the experienced ABC News and Current Affairs executive Bob Kersley for On the Front Line. For Frontline, I understand that there were 2 documentaries in the series planned on David's footage held in ABC archives. The second part will feature Brill's 10 years in the United States for the ABC, covering President Carter, Ford and Reagan, presidents and conflicts in Central America. The third and final episode will feature Afghanistan, Iraq, and the breaking up of Yugoslavia with Somalia. I hope that you can support the development of this project and this priceless archival film that the ABC has, presented by this remarkable cameraman, David Brill, who has moved seamlessly into his new role in front of the camera, not behind it. And of course, a rerun of the first in the series, On the Front Line. And thank you for having me, and now let's see the movie.